Hello, everyone. My name is Larry Taylor. You are tuning into a production of People for Democratic Party Reform. I'm here with my co-host, Keri Capen. Welcome, Keri.
Hi.
Today's show is about the tools in your toolbox if you attend a meeting that is run under parliamentary rules of order or run as a democratic society. So our agenda that we'll be going through is how to make something happen with a motion I move, how to suspend the rules, what calling the question means and how that is supposed to function, and then 3 related motions: point of information, point of order, and appeal, key sections of the bylaws which you should study before you go to a meeting. And then the last topic we will hit is what a parliamentarian does. So what they don't want you to know is that the DNC meeting, the Democratic National Committee meeting, where all of our DNC members get together once a quarter, and as well as state and territory central committee meetings, and then county organizations, most likely have Robert's Rules of Order as their parliamentary authority. And so what this means is that that you as a member, if you are a member of these organizations, have all of the rights that every other member has. And what we are talking about today applies to all of their meetings. I was a DNC member for a couple of years, and I was very surprised to travel all over the country to go to these quarterly meetings. And we'd get to the primary meeting, and there would be the presentation of the colors and then all kinds of ceremonies. And the meetings would last for about 2 hours, 3 hours. And back then, sometimes the president would show up and give a speech, but there was very little business. In fact, there was no business transacted. And it didn't occur to me until I actually started studying parliamentary procedure and reading the bylaws of the DNC that these meetings are all democratically run meetings, and that you have rights to do things. And so and this includes the agenda that the DNC meeting runs under. So there is a default agenda in the parliamentary authority that should be used, but it's rarely followed. But one of the things that, for instance, that should be on the agenda is new business. And there should be a microphone where any member can walk up to the microphone and introduce new business onto the floor. You will probably get the glares of 199 other members sitting on the floor because you're like not behaving properly, but that is your right to do. And so what we're talking about today are things that you can do to transform some of these meetings from being ceremonies into being actual meetings where business is transacted.
I think another thing that happens, or that I know I've heard in state and county meetings, is, well, we don't really use Robert's Rules of Order. We just use Bob's rules, and it's more informal. The problem with using quote-unquote Bob's rules is that means that only the people in the know what those rules are. And so they can just pull out, and it's like, well, that's not how we do things. And there's no way to verify that or back that up or anything. So it's important to use a universally recognized system because of that. Because otherwise, then just a select few number of people can quote unquote know the rules, and that's undemocratic. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how you just basically broadly how you make a motion. And so you do that by saying, I move to blah blah blah, whatever it is that you want to do. Not I make a motion. A lot of people use that, and it gets your point across, but properly it should be, I move that this organization do X, Y, and Z. Once that happens, then there's kind of a sequence of events that'll happen. So what usually happens in meetings is there's 2 sorts of people. There's people who say, I wish that we had data on voters so we could support the campaign. Or I move that a committee be formed to identify voters in the next primary to report back at the next meeting, and that the committee be chaired by Jane. So one is actually proposing a specific action that be taken and results that result from those actions, where the other is just talking into the air that I just wish things would just magically happen. So when you make a motion, then that is requiring actual action. And that's important, because otherwise, then what are you doing at the meeting? It's a waste of time. So there's a couple things about making a motion. A motion is in order when there's no other question or another motion pending. So, you've taken a vote on something, or you finished one activity, you as a member can stand up and say, I move that, well, you get recognized from the chair. I move that, blah, blah, blah. So you get recognized by the chair, the member states their motion. Almost always the motion requires a second. So another member in the room needs to say, they can just shout out that they second it. You don't have to agree with the motion. You just have to think that it needs to be discussed. So here's the key part. So the members made their motion. It's been seconded. Now the chair states the motion to the group. So at this point, right, as soon as the chair states the motion, then it belongs to the assembly. So up until that point, the member who made the motion can make changes, they can withdraw it, they can do whatever they want. But as soon as the chair states the motion, it belongs to the assembly. And then that means that only the assembly can decide what to do with it. And there's lots of things they can do with it. They can change it. They can postpone consideration. They can refer it out to a committee. They can do all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, the assembly as a whole is what's deciding with it. So once the motion's been stated, the chair will ask for debate. And then you talk about the pros and cons of the motion. Usually the person who made the motion gets to talk first. The presiding officer, they should do their very best to alternate pros and cons. Sometimes that's not always possible, but do the best. They try and do the best that they can. That's also during the debate portion is when you can do you can make amendments, you can refer to committee, you can do things to it. So I move that the organization sells all of the vehicles it owns within the next 30 days. Larry would second me. And then the chair would state that motion. And that you do that so that the assembly knows exactly what you're voting on, what you're talking about, so there is no ambiguity about what the motion is, what you're talking about. And it's the job of the presiding officer also to keep things restricted to that topic. Like sometimes members want to go off on a tangent and talk about something else, and it's the presiding officer's job to be like, that's not what we're talking about right now, but bring that up later when it's appropriate. So let's say, but what happens if you're going through your agenda in a meeting and something comes up and you want to move to a different item further down the agenda than what's next? Then we can do what you call suspending the rules. Larry?
Oh, just one more thing on motions. Again, you need to be a little politically aware when you do these things. So unless you have an extremely difficult organization that you're working with, you should do preparation before you go to the meeting. You should line up people behind you who will speak to the motion and back you up and certainly vote for you. And hopefully you are in an organization where the chair is doing their job appropriately and you can share the motion with them in advance, so you're not broadsiding anybody. But think through politically how you handle this stuff so you can ensure your odds of success.
Yeah.
The next thing we're going to talk about is suspending the rules. This is something that is not commonly known. But this is when a proposal, so the basic rule is a proposal cannot be in conflict with the organization's bylaws or local, state, or national law prescribing procedural rules applicable to the organization, or with the fundamental principle of parliamentary law. But you can do this thing called suspend the rules. And this can be made at any time that no question is pending. It can be applied to any rule of the assembly except bylaws, and even then there are certain exceptions. It's out of order when another has the floor. It must be seconded, but it is not debatable. So it's very similar to making a motion, except that this one is not debatable. And so the way rules that are there, so the exception for the bylaws, it is a little bit of a brain twister. So the fundamental rule is you can't suspend the bylaws because those are things that you have agreed to abide by in the organization. But sometimes rules of order, which are procedural things, are built into the bylaws. And so there is this exception where rules that are clearly identified as in the nature of a rule of order that are placed within the bylaws can be suspended. And you should probably talk with a parliamentarian about this, so you're very, very clear about what is a rule of order as opposed to a fundamental right, because those definitely cannot be suspended. And then there's another case where bylaws have provisions within the bylaws for the suspension of certain things. So it'll say that you got this rule accepted by a vote of 2/3, it can be suspended.
Yeah, a really common one that you see is elections of officers have to be by ballot unless there's only one, but this provision can be suspended by a vote of 2/3 if there's only one candidate, and then it can be by unanimous consent. So that's a common one that you see in bylaw.
So an interesting one I came across, because sometimes you have chairs that insist that they, by virtue of the bylaws, are the only ones that can preside at meetings, and they also think that because they're the presiding officer, they're the king or queen or the empress of the meeting, when in fact, really their role is to carry out the will of the people. But you can actually remove the chair, and even though it says that the chair presides, because you have a vice chair to back them up. And so an example of a rule of order in the bylaws that can be suspended is that the one that says the chair has the authority to preside at all meetings, because that is clearly in the nature of a rule of order. So anything that is in the nature of a rule of order can be suspended. And this is because you have this fundamental concept of really it is the will of the majority that decides what to do. And you have things that are built in that require a 2/3 vote because that means that you're taking away somebody's rights and so it has a higher threshold. But really the majority of an assembly should be able to do whatever they want to do with certain exceptions.
Yeah.
And to suspend the rules, a particular rule or rules to be suspended are not mentioned, but the motion must be stated, state its specific purpose. So it sounds something like, I move to suspend the rules so that we can consider something or other that, because you have a rule of order or something that suspends it. And what were you going to add, Keri?
Well, I was just going to say kind of what you had said. So, I move that we suspend the rules so that we can move to XYZ member motion item on the agenda, so you can skip over agenda items. And that would require a suspension of the rules. So you're not mentioning that you're altering the orders of the meeting, but you are in effect doing that. So it's just it's a tricky one, but and it's often worded incorrectly, but I try not to quibble about those kind of details if possible. As long as it's not hurting anybody, if the format's not quite right, but the intention is clear, you're probably good. So something that gets abused in meetings a lot, and my own special pet peeve, is calling the question or calling the previous question. So the way it's supposed to work is that when you call the question, you are making a motion to end debate. So the previous question is not debatable. Excuse me, but it does need to be seconded. But it's almost never done correctly. So you've got 30 people in the room standing, waiting to debate, and we've already been debating something for a really long time. You can get it when you get up to your turn at the microphone. You can say, "I move to call the question," and it gets seconded, and then immediately debate stops, and you take a vote on whether or not you're going to end debate. And because you're infringing on a member's rights that we talked about last week, that you have the right to debate, it requires a 2/3 majority to end debate. So you take a vote. All those in favor say aye. All those no, opposed say no. You've got a 2/3 majority. Debate is over, and you move to a vote on the motion that's in front of you. If it fails, then you just go right back to debate as if it never happened. But what often happens is a couple things. Either somebody will just randomly shout out in the crowd, call the question. And a presiding officer who doesn't know what they're doing will just be like, okay, so we're just going to vote on the motion then, and debate is over, and nobody gets any say on it. That's not cool. You've just violated all the rights of the members in the room on the say-so of one person. We don't want to do that. The other thing that they might do is somebody will, they might even make it correctly. They'll either call it out or make a proper motion, and there's nobody wanting to speak in debate. So then you have to go through and have a vote and do all the things. If you have a smart presiding officer, you'll say, your motion to call the question is out of order at this time because there's nobody wanting to debate anyway, so we're just going to skip it. So it can get weaponized against you, basically. So you want to use the call to question to bring to an immediate vote on one or more pending questions. So one of the principles of parliamentary procedure is that you only deal with one question at a time. But what can happen is you can have kind of stacking motions that you have to decide one, and then the next, and then the next. So you can call the question on the whole sequence, or you can call the question on one thing. I won't get into, there's lots of details, and we probably do a whole show about just calling the question if you want it. But so you close debate, stops amendments on the questions, and you just go straight to a vote. It's one of those things that is not allowed in committees because committees exist to talk things to death, basically. Like that's why you have a committee, so that you can talk about things for months and weeks and years and days and hours. So you cannot call the question in committee. So it's out of order when another has the floor. So you can't just scream out, call the question, and expect that to fly. It has to be seconded. It's not debatable, and it's not amendable. And that makes sense because you're moving to end debate. You don't want to open another debate, and it requires a 2/3 vote because, again, you're abridging the rights of other members. Like I said previously, somebody calls the question without being recognized. The chair ends debate without a vote. Or the motion isn't seconded, but the chair proceeds. So sometimes you can get away with not having a second, but for calling the question, you really, really got to have a second because, again, you're abridging the rights of the members. One of the things I like about parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order is that it protects the rights of the members. That's what it's there for, to make sure that everybody gets heard and everybody understands what's going on and is making decisions in a democratic manner.
So there are three related motions that we're going to talk about next. And sometimes Robert's Rules of Order feels like a chess game where you have to have a couple of moves lined up in order to get to where you want to go. And so the three related motions that we're going to talk about is a request for information, point of order, and then appeal the ruling of the chair. So the first one is a request for information. Not everyone has studied Robert's Rules of Order, and sometimes you need more information on a motion that is on the floor. And so you do not have to sit there and feel that you have to vote in ignorance. You can always request for information. So the request for information is is exactly that, and it's directed to the chair. And then even if you want it from another member, you always go through the chair, and then the chair will ask someone else in the room to respond if that's what the appropriate thing is to do. and it's for information relevant to the business at hand.
You can also make, kind of related to this, the parliamentary inquiry. So if you are wondering how to do something or what the result of doing something would be, then you would make a parliamentary inquiry. It's one of the duties of the presiding officer is to answer these questions to the best of their ability. They might refer you to a parliamentarian if they have one handy, but the presiding officer is there to facilitate business. So if you don't understand how if you want to do something and you don't know how to do it, then it's the presiding officer's job to guide you through that and help you make it. Like, they can't make motions themselves, but they can say, well, they can either solicit motions by saying, I would entertain a motion to do X, Y, and Z, or they can work one-on-one with the person and kind of work through what it is they're trying to do and how you would do it. So if you want to do something and aren't sure how, or you want to make a motion and you're not sure that the results will be what you're trying to do, then that would be a parliamentary inquiry. So you're talking about the actual specific mechanics of what's going on. Whereas a request for information is more like, hey, we're talking about real estate transactions, and I have questions for the realtor. Then you would want more information from them. So.
And certainly if you want to do something and you don't know how to express that in terms of a parliamentary motion, again, you don't have to be an expert on Robert's Rules of Order. You can say, Chair, how do I postpone something on the agenda to a later point in the meeting? And they should tell you what the proper way to do that is. And the role of the chair is just to make sure that everyone in the meeting knows what's being discussed and how it's being discussed and what their rights are. And anyone who's using Robert's rules against you to stifle democracy or stifle debate should be removed. We do have notes on some of the slides where it says RONR and then a page number. So RONR stands for Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. And that's the current edition, which is the 11th edition. And then often we have the page number set out. So you can go get a copy of Robert's Rules of Order and look up the details of anything that we're talking about, because we don't, no one has the patience for us to go into great detail on these things.
Yeah, we like this kind of stuff, but some of the motions that we're presenting as really simple and straightforward will take up 30 or 40 pages in Robert's Rules, because there'll be exceptions, and in this circumstance then you do this, and the general layperson in your average meeting is not going to need to know that much detail, but we like to give you citations so that one, we're not just making stuff up, and two, so you can go and look more stuff up if you want.
Two things to do you want to talk about?
No, go ahead.
Some things about the request for information and parliamentary inquiry. They are in order when another has the floor. They do not require a second. So if you have a parliamentary inquiry, you don't need someone else to second your inquiry. You should be able to request that information and get that from the chair. It is not amendable, so someone can't say, I move that we actually not ask the question on this, it's about something else. So no one can amend it, and it's not debatable. So you have the right to ask the chair for information or for a parliamentary inquiry without it being debated and without it being amended, and you don't need a second.
Right. The chair might say that, if you have a parliamentary inquiry, if it's not relevant to what's happening right that second, they might say, that's not in order at this time. When we get to that part of the agenda, or if that's something that we can talk about later, and so they can postpone it. Or if there's a request for information and it's for the next item of business on the agenda, the chair can say, okay, yeah, no, I'll make sure you get that. I'll give you that information when we get to that item. So it does have to be relevant to what you're talking about. The chair, if you're just throwing out random questions about parliamentary procedure, the chair can tell you, yeah, no, we're not talking about that right now.
So the next tool in your toolbox that we're going to talk about is point of order. And this is where you can start to see how these tools work together. So perhaps someone has done something that you don't think is appropriate. And so the first, if you're not absolutely sure whether what was done was appropriate, the first thing you should do is do a parliamentary inquiry and say, Madam Chair, what is the proper process for appointing someone to a committee or whatever you think that was done improperly? When the chair should respond to that, and if they respond in a way that conflicts how this was handled, that's when you have to do the next step in the process, which is to raise a point of order. And this is critical, because if you don't raise a point of order, that means that whatever is being done is going to be the prevailing process for the rest of the meeting, and you might end up with results that you had that was not intended. And so democracy is a participatory sport, and sometimes you have to put on the big boy pants or the big girl pants and go up to the mic and do a point of order. And that's when a member thinks that the rules of the assembly are being violated. This is when you make a point of order, thereby calling upon the chair for a ruling and an enforcement of the regular rules. So if you see something going incorrectly, you can say point of order, blah, 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 blah. And then the chair should recognize, if they are in error, that the meeting has gone incorrectly, and they should correct it.
You can also call points of orders on other members. So let's say, one of the rules of debate is that members generally only get to speak twice on a particular question. So if you've got one member who really likes the sound of their own voice, and they're being asked to be recognized to speak 77 times, you as another member can pop up and say, Madam or Mr. President, point of order, this particular member has already spoken 77 times. Don't we have a rule saying that members only get to speak twice on a question? And then if your presiding officer is doing what they should, it would be like, your point of order is correct, and so the other member can sit down and shut up, basically. So it's handy, but you can also use it on the chair. So if the chair is doing something screwy, and a lot of times that just happens because they lose track of what's going on, or they just want to hurry things along, or it doesn't have to be for nefarious reasons, although sometimes it is, then you can call a point of order on the chair and be like, hey, Madam Chair, you can't do X, Y, and Z, and then they have to make a ruling. And then once you have a ruling, then we'll talk about how you proceed from there. And points of order are what's called incidental motions. So they're, I won't get into it too much because it's not really important, but it's not directly pertaining to the business at hand, but it does need to be addressed before you can take care of the business that's at hand. So it takes precedence over any pending questions. It can be applied to any breach of the Assembly's rules. It is in order when another has the floor, so you can interrupt people. It does not require a second, and it's not debatable. The chair just makes a ruling on it.
Yeah, so as in Keri's example, where someone is speaking for the 55th time and they don't pause to take a breath, but they just are a stream of consciousness, this is where you can interrupt and say, point of order, and actually interrupt them. And you have every right to do that.
Yeah.
One thing about points of order is timeliness. So this is a concept that you need to keep in mind. It must be raised promptly at the time the breach occurs. So you can't raise a point of order later on something that happened earlier in the meeting because the business has been concluded and the meeting has moved on. Points of order regarding the conduct of a vote must be raised immediately following the announcement of the vote result. We've experienced where elections have been questioned afterward, and there's some very specific instances where the vote can be questioned, but really, if you don't like how a vote was conducted, or you think that things were the votes are counted illegally or whatever you think was wrong, you have to contest it at the time of the election and resolve it there. Otherwise, odds are the results of the election is going to stand. And the exception to this is what is called breaches of a continuing nature. And there's some definitions about that. A breach of a continuing nature is something where something is incorrect and it goes beyond the meeting. And so the effect of something that was decided continues. And those are the kinds of things that can be brought up later as a point of order and then addressed inside of meeting.
And the reason for the timeliness is, so Robert's Rules allows for custom of organizations. So if, a particular procedure, letting members talk 55 times on a question is working for them, then there's no real reason to change it. As long as nobody's rights are being violated and business is being moved in a timely manner, then you don't have to be that strict in following all of the rules. But that custom can fall by the wayside when it's challenged. So, let's say when you've got 10 people in a group and everybody is talking and talking, that's not as big of a deal as if you have 50 people in the room and everybody wants to talk 77 times. That'll drag meetings out to be 8 years long. And so you can raise a point of order and say, hey, our rules say this. Can we please get back to that? And then you can get back to that. So custom does have a place in parliamentary procedure, but it's one of the lower ranking criteria. So that's why, so if things are just dragging on and you raise a point of order, that's why it needs to be addressed right then and there. So what happens if you've raised a point of order and the chair makes a ruling? So you say, hey, point of order. This member has spoken, we have a rule saying that people can only speak for 2 minutes, and this person has been droning on for 15 minutes. Can we please have them sit down and let other people talk? And the chair says, no, it's totally cool. This person can talk. They're a friend of mine, and I like what they have to say. And so they get to keep talking. So the chair has made a ruling, and you disagree with that ruling. So what you can do is you can say that I appeal the ruling of the chair. And then you have another member second that. And so now basically you've taken it out of the hands of the chair, and the question is now before the assembly. So in this example, can this member who's been speaking for 15 minutes continue speaking, or do they need to be limited back to 2 minutes? And the presiding officer, if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, will then have a debate. You can debate this motion. Talk about, yes, the chair is completely correct, and we should definitely just let people blather on forever and ever and ever. Or you can say, no, we need to stick to our rules, 2 minutes, we'll have a timekeeper and all that. And then you vote on it. And so the decision gets put into the hands of the assembly rather than the chair. It takes precedence over any question that's pending at the time. It's in order when somebody else has the floor. So the chair makes the ruling, the person goes back to droning on about whatever. You can stand up and say that you appeal the ruling of the chair. And there's this particular rules on the debate, and we won't get into that unless somebody really, really wants to know. But it's not a smackdown on the chair. It's not anything other than, hey, I don't agree with what the chair has decided, and so you want to broaden that out to the rest of the assembly so that they can decide as a group. Because remember, the ultimate authority in any assembly are the members. So they have the right to override the decision of the chair. And I think people forget that. And chairs, presiding officers get their feelings hurt when people try and appeal their rulings. It's not personal. I suppose it could be, but it shouldn't be personal. It should just be a question of following the rules. So I think, Larry, you have an example for us.
Oh, just another slide on appeal of rulings of the chair. So it takes precedence over any question pending at the time the chair makes the ruling. It is an order when another has the floor, but it must be seconded, and it is debatable with certain rules. So before you embark on appealing the ruling of the chair, it's best that you read that section of Robert's Rules of Order so you're very clear on the order. Because if you want to embark on something, you need to be up on the rules that govern it. And then there is an exception when the chair rules on a question about which there cannot possibly be two reasonable options. An appeal is not allowed. So the chair will say, the appeal is out of order, and they can do that if it meets this condition. But if it's an area of ambiguity, for example, then it is up to the body to decide ultimately, which is one of the things that I love about Robert's Rules of Order and democracy, because as Keri said, it's an illustration of where the power ultimately resides in the assembly, not in the chair. So we do have a script because sometimes these things don't make a lot of sense in the abstract. And so what we're going to do is go through a script on a meeting, and so Keri's going to be the chair, and I'm going to be the member, and then Oz is going to be the backup member for certain actions inside this meeting. So and what this script does is illustrate how point of order, point of information, and the appeal all work together to accomplish something in the meeting.
Okay, we ready?
Yes.
Is there any further new business?
Point of information.
The member will state his point of information.
Has the chair established a committee for writing the rules and procedures for the delegates selection conventions for the 2020 Democratic National Convention?
The chair has not established a committee. The chair has asked the first vice chair and the three elected DNC delegates to work on the policies and procedures.
So point of order.
The member will state his point.
The chair is in violation of parliamentary procedures by, in effect, creating a committee to perform tasks that fall within the assigned function of an existing standing committee.
The point is not well taken. It has been customary for the rules of the delegate selection conventions to be performed by the DPO officers. That is the way we have always done it.
I appeal the decision of the chair.
I second.
The decision of the chair, just as an aside, guys, this is how it should go. The decision of the chair is appealed from. The question is, shall the decision of the chair stand as the judgment of the assembly? The chair believes that due to the complexity and required close working relationship between the DPO and the DNC, it is best that the rules and procedures be written by a special committee. Where the bylaws state that the Rules Committee is responsible for state conventions, this only applies to the platform convention.
I think the chair is in the best position to decide where the rules are written, so I urge everyone to vote yes.
Robert's Rules of Order state on page 492 that a special committee may not be appointed to perform a task that falls within the assigned function of an existing standing committee. The bylaws state that rules and procedures for state conventions are the responsibility of the Rules Committee. If the bylaws meant this to be limited to the platform convention, it would have clearly stated that limitation. Therefore, it is a violation of the bylaws for anyone other than the Rules Committee to write rules and procedures for what are clearly state conventions. I urge the membership to vote no on the decision and abide by the bylaws.
It has always been the custom for a special committee.
Point of order.
The member will state his point.
During the appeal, no member is allowed to speak more than once.
The point is well taken. Are there any additional debates from members who have not yet spoken? Seeing no further debate.
Point of information.
The member will state the question.
What does a yes vote do?
A yes vote will validate the chair's decision to have the rules written outside of the Rules Committee. A no vote will refer the state delegate selection convention rules to the Rules Committee. Those in favor of sustaining the chair's decision say aye. Those opposed to sustaining this decision say no.
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 The noes have it. The 2020 Democratic National Convention rules and procedures will be written by the Rules Committee.
So this is a very formally written script that goes by the book. And so in an actual meeting, you don't have to talk like you're in the 18th century, as long as everyone understands what you're doing. But basically, that's how you use these tools to get something changed, especially when it involves the power of the organization. And we often find ourselves in a power struggle where power has been taken away from the assembly by the leadership. Do we have any questions? Go ahead, Keri.
No, if there's any questions, that'd be great. But and that was like like I said before, that was the ideal version. Like that's how it should go. That's often not how it goes. And if you read in Robert's rules about some of the things, then what you can do if there's not a thing. So the question, can convention rules include a provision that the ruling of the chair is final? So that would be in violation of parliamentary procedure. However, rules and bylaws do override or can override parliamentary procedure. So you could have a rule in there like that. I think it would be a really bad idea, but Larry, what do you think?
Yeah, you can do that, but this is why you have to pay attention to what's going on. The most boring part of conventions is the very beginning where you approve the rules of the convention. And so this is the point, even at the Democratic National Convention, where you can stand up and object to something. You know, with 4,500 people in the room staring at you, it's going to take a lot of guts to do that, but hopefully you're not always in a convention of that size, and that you can question rules. So hopefully your rules committee has set up rules for the convention that are there to facilitate business and just make it as democratic as possible. But if you find things have been written into the rules that inappropriately take away power from the assembly, then you should question these and get them changed at the very beginning, because once you have accepted the rules at the beginning of the convention, it is very hard to reverse that later. So read the rules, object to any things that you find objectionable. Hopefully you've received the rules in advance, and so that you can work with your like-minded people and can get people to speak for your motion and get it overturned. Because what you're going to have is a lot of people staring at you going, why are these people blocking our meeting? We just want to get on with the business and go to our cocktail party. Go ahead, Keri.
Yeah. And definitely, like Larry said, you should get a copy of the rules in advance. Talk to parliamentarians like Larry or I or others, to clarify anything. Like, you can read, you as a layperson can read through the rules and be like, well, I don't even understand what this means. Then you can consult with a parliamentarian or a parliamentary minded person and ask, like, what does this mean when it says X? What happens? Why is it structured that way? Because sometimes there are good reasons why things are the way they are, and so you don't want to undo good ideas, but always want to ask questions and read through those documents. I mean, I read documents like that for fun. I understand that most people do not. We have another question. Thank you, Leslie. This is what led to the chaos of 2016 Nevada State Dem Convention. Yeah, exactly. That there was all kinds of screwy rules and then screwy procedural things that didn't go how they should have gone. But this is why you need to be informed about your governing documents, whether they are convention rules or your bylaws. And Larry's going to talk about bylaws and things that you should definitely pay attention to in your bylaws.
Yes. So one of the things when you join an organization or are elected to an organization is you should be given a copy of the bylaws. I actually cannot think of a time when I have been given the bylaws, including the Democratic National Committee. But you should be given the bylaws or a link to the bylaws. If that does not happen, you should track it down, because these are the rules by which the organization is run by. And you need to understand how much power has been taken away from the assembly and given to the leadership, because if you find wholesale things have been given away, then you're really at a disadvantage. There are some key things that you should familiarize yourself in the bylaws, and these are things that are commonly violated, especially when people want to retain control of what's going on and don't want people interfering with whatever they got going on. The meeting notice and who can call a meeting are very important things to understand. So if there is a meeting notice of 5 days and they try calling a meeting with 24 hours notice, then that puts into question the validity of the meeting, because they did not meet the requirement for a meeting notice. As a member of an organization, you have the right to attend meetings, and the reason why there's a prior notice provision is that is the requirement to allow you time to make arrangements to attend the meeting. And then there's always a fight over who can call a meeting. There's people who assert that because it says that the chair can call it, then only the chair can call it. Hopefully there's provisions in there for like a number of members of the executive committee to call it, or for a number of the membership to call it. If the calling officer refuses to call a meeting because they want to try to block actions from happening, and actually Keri experienced this in her county committee, the chair refused to hold a meeting for 2 months in violation of the bylaws, because the bylaws says they have to meet monthly, but he refused to have a meeting because he didn't want certain actions to happen in that meeting. What Robert's rules, the language inside Robert's rules itself is can be considered ambiguous, although I don't. And so what we have done to help clarify this is that Roberts wrote a companion book called Parliamentary Law, and then he talks in there about what happens when a chair doesn't call a meeting, and who makes it, who can then step up and make it happen. So important to know what the requirements are for the meeting notice and who can call it. What is the quorum requirement? So there is a number of people that have to be in a meeting for it to be a valid meeting. Otherwise, you can question the actions that were taken in the meeting. There is an allowance where you can take actions in the meeting, but the actions have to be ratified at the subsequent valid meeting. And they can overturn the actions taken at the invalid meeting if that's what happened. So you need to know what the quorum requirement is. Some organizations get themselves into this quandary where their quorum is so large that it can never be attained, and then they can't get a quorum together to modify the bylaws to make it more reasonable. And so, you need to be cognizant of that. Also, it is possible that you have a meeting going on and it's a 4 hour through the meeting, someone notices that a lot of people have left. You should be aware of what the quorum is, because if a number of people have left, you need to make a point of order and halt the business of the meeting, because you can't legally transact business if there's not a quorum. But if you don't make a point of order, then you've just let the business continue. You need to know what the definition of a member is and read this very carefully, because this is where voting rights might be withheld from people. It's one of the earlier sections of the bylaws, and it's very clear what a member is. And if you are a member, you cannot be denied the right to attend meetings, to debate, to vote. They cannot be taken away from you except through disciplinary procedures, either from the parliamentary authority or in something that's described in the bylaws. So if you are a member, such as if you have been elected to the State Central Committee, you have rights which have to be respected.
And some organizations do have different classifications of members. And so the rights of those individual classifications should be clearly laid out as well. Because you can have associate members or provisional members or ex officio members, and those different kind of classifications should have clearly delineated rights between them. But basically, if you're an associate member and it says that associate members get to vote on X, Y, and Z, then they only get to vote on those things mentioned, but the other rights are assumed unless they're explicitly taken away. So if it doesn't talk about being able to speak in debate or make motions, then you should assume that you are able to do that as an associate member, for example.
And one thing to look for, and you probably have to read the entire set of bylaws to understand this, is what powers have been allocated away from the assembly. So say that you're a model railroad club, and what the membership really wants to do is play with trains in their model railroad yard, and they really don't care about who pays the rent and who does the administrivia. And so in bylaws and groups like that, they might have allocated extreme decision power making to the executive committee or to the president or whomever, because that's really not their interest. And as long as the trains run, they're perfectly happy. We went through
and there
a period.
are good reasons.
Yes.
There's good reasons to allocate authority away from the assembly, because you want to find a balance between democracy and deciding things collectively and agility. Like, there are instances, and you can lay those out, where you need a smaller group of people or even a single individual to be able to make decisions on a quicker basis. Because if you're only meeting quarterly, well, there's stuff that happens in between those meetings, and there does need to be some authority divided out to a smaller body to be able to make those decisions. So not all division of power is bad per se, but you do need to be aware of who has the authority to do what and make sure that it doesn't get too lopsided.
And what you might find is that, we went through this happy period where we thought we were one big happy family and everyone was in agreement, and bylaws changes were made, which inappropriately transferred power from the membership to the leadership. And then suddenly we get to 2016, where there's a disagreement in some fundamental things in the party. And what many state organizations have found is that an inappropriate amount of power has been given away, or that the organization has been structured so that the power has been taken away from them, and it would take years to claw that back. So what you need to do is understand really where the power has been allocated and what they're allowed to do. We often have chairs who do things that they're not authorized to do, and this is where you need the point of order to call them on that. Like, typically, chairs can't refer things to committees, and so a good chair would say, I would entertain a motion to refer this matter to the Rules Committee, and then someone from the floor would make that motion, and it would be seconded and then voted upon. It's not the power of the chair to refer that to a committee unless it has been given to them in the bylaws. So very important to understand what has been given away. And then finally, when do elections occur? There was a neighborhood association in one of our major cities here in Oregon where they tried to have elections, and nobody showed up for the meeting, so they didn't have a quorum. And so the leadership thought nobody cared, and they continued on. Well, it turns out that the membership did care, and that there were people who were interested in running for elections. And so it became very contentious because it felt like people were withholding power, and that might have or might not have been the instance. What the membership should have done is that they should have had the bylaws at their disposal, and they should have looked up how the elections are to be conducted and when they're to be conducted and what is the term of office. And then what do you do in the case of there not being a quorum, and what do you do when there's mandated business for a certain period of time, but you were not able to achieve that? These are all things that are specified on how they're handled inside the parliamentary procedure in ways so that everyone's rights are protected. And so this is why it is good to understand the parliamentary procedure and have a parliamentarian to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, so that leads us into what a parliamentarian does. So Larry and I are both parliamentarians. We're both members of the National Association of Parliamentarians. which my husband likes to say it's not a coincidence that the acronym for that is SNAP, but we find it interesting. So like I said, I read bylaws for fun. But my role in a meeting, so the parliamentarian is a consultant who advises the president, other officers, committees, and members on matters of parliamentary procedure. So if people have questions, then we can answer them. A lot of times I get contacted from people, outside of meetings, and they're like, hey, we want to do a thing. How do we do that thing? And I can help walk them through it. Or they say, something happened in our last meeting and it really didn't seem right. Was it not right? And what can we do about it now? So that's kind of the consulting end of things. But then during a meeting, generally the parliamentarian is giving advice to the chair. So if the chair is not certain on how to proceed on something, they can consult with the parliamentarian and we'll tell them, how the proper way to do something. The parliamentarian should also call attention of the chair to any errors in the proceedings. So there's some gray area there. I generally come down on the side of if it's not violating anybody's rights and things are still kind of humming along, if it's not technically correct, I'll generally kind of let it slide. But other people are more hard-nosed about it than others. And also it really depends on if there's rights being violated. So you call the let the chair know if there's any error in the proceeding. Very rarely talk to the assembly directly. If requested that I do so, I'm more than happy to do that. It just it depends on the organization, and it depends on if a member has requested that I explain what my reasoning is, then perfectly willing to do that. So the parliamentarian advises the chair. They don't make rulings. They issue opinions and say, this is what happened. This is, what principles were violated. This is what you can do more from here on out. But the ultimate decision on how to proceed lies with the chair. So then the chair would, taking into consideration the opinion of the parliamentarian, will make a ruling, and then those rulings can be appealed by the assembly, by the members of the organization. That's really important because the parliamentarian, we can tell you what Robert says and what parliamentary law says and all that, and then the proper way to do things. But ultimately, if the assembly doesn't want to do it that way, they don't have to. So if it's working for you guys as members, then do that, quite honestly. So it's just, you just don't want parliamentarians to just be, power behind the throne and running things, because that's not what our role is.
Yeah, often you see the chair of a committee or of an organization say what the parliamentarian said, like they are some ultimate authority, but that is not their role. Right. There are nuances of parliamentary procedure, and so any of this can be certainly questioned, and parliamentarians make mistakes. So one of the things that you can ask for is an opinion. If they are a credentialed parliamentarian, they would know what that is, and that's where they cite the rules and the situation and give an analysis of and a conclusion of how a certain situation should be handled. And if they're an ethical parliamentarian, everything will be tight and it'll make perfect sense on what they do and how they've come to the conclusion. If they've documented things that are just absolutely inappropriate and stretching the rules beyond all recognition, then there is a ethics committee within the National Association of Parliamentarians that you can refer them to, because their role is really to enable democracy. And if they are not doing that, then they need to be brought to the attention of the authorities so that it could be addressed.
And so one of the best ways that you as a member can prevent autocratic rule by the chair or parliamentarians pulling the strings behind the scenes is to have this general familiarity with Robert's rules. So we have a new edition coming out in the fall, the 12th edition. It's very exciting. It's pretty in white and gold. The current edition is black and gold. I would recommend, honestly, that you not get that book. It's hard to read, and unless you really, really want to learn about parliamentary procedure and get all the ins and outs and go down all the rabbit trails, don't get that one. What you should get is the yellow book, Robert's Rules of Order in Brief. It's written in plain English. It's very short, has example scripts and how the exact wording of motions and how you do them and how they should be processed. And it's really, really readable, and it has all the information that you're going to need, 90% of the time. I would definitely, make friends with parliamentarians and maybe have a copy of Robert's Rules just kind of in your back pocket, but that's going to be a lot more information than you're typically going to need.
And for people for Democratic Party reform, I would urge every state to have an identified parliamentarian, either within the organization or someone that they can call upon for help and assistance, because in many cases we're up against people who have been developing these ways to circumvent democracy for nearly 200 years. And so you need help understanding some of this stuff, and especially understanding what your rights are. On the website, pdpr.org, are links to 2 ways in which someone can learn more about this. So there are, within the National Association of Parliamentarians, there are chapters within most major metropolitan areas in the United States that you can look up and join. And these are really great ways to talk about the rules and understand how they can be applied to different circumstances, and learn from other people who have a lot of experience with this. If you live in a state where there's got a lot of rural areas, such as what Keri and I live in, most of the state is rural, and it would take an hour's drive to get to one of the meetings that's, say, in the Portland area. We have virtual groups now. There's one on the East Coast called the Green Gavel, and then we have a group on the West Coast called the Cascadia Parliamentary Study Group. The links to join them are on the pdpr.org website. And whether or not you want to be a professional registered parliamentarian or just want to learn your rights inside meetings, you're welcome to join those groups and virtually hook up with people to talk about these issues. And it's also a great place to bring things that you are interested in understanding, like was this a correct thing for the chair to have done, or was this inappropriate, and what would have been the proper way in which to handle it. So you are more than welcome to join up on those. The way to get involved with people for Democratic Party reform, again, the website is pdpr.org. That's on the next slide, Oz. There's a button to join, and then there's the links to study parliamentary procedure, and currently there's a form for nominating people, because at our next meeting we're going to be conducting elections. And again, People for Democratic Party Reform is a coalition of people from across the United States who are interested in making reforms to the Democratic Party so that the organization is more democratic. The whole concept of democracy is aspirational, and we need to move the party in that direction. If you would like to follow me in Twitter, my Twitter handle is ltaylor_PDPR. And then on Facebook, where we post meetings and general updates, it's Democratic Party Reform. We do have a super chat window, so if you would like to financially support Uphill Media, who helps us broadcast shows such as this, please go to the super chat window. It's the little folder at the bottom of the chat window with a $ on it. And any amount of money is greatly appreciated. Even $2 is great. Last time we had someone contribute $50, which is a very generous contribution. We would greatly appreciate anything that you would like to throw in. We have a logo now for People for Democratic Party Reform. Gorgeous logo developed by Ashley Terry, and you can get it on numerous pieces of apparel. It's also available at pdpr.org on the merch tab. It is made by a company that does on-demand creation. So we don't have to have this huge inventory warehouse of supplies. You can pick whatever you want and have the logo printed on that. It would be fantastic if we could get people wearing this, especially when the Trump plague lifts and we can start attending meetings and start showing up in numbers. People can look at the audience and see where we are represented and understand that we really want change. Is there any final questions to be answered, Oz?
Yeah, Larry, actually, it's been a great show. Thanks to you and Keri. And it was a rousing conversation in there. On the lines of that, Thomas Havlaka, abuse of power is the worst form of corruption because the misuse becomes the norm and additional abuse will follow. Well said, Thomas. And I want to say, because there were some comments about, I don't want anything to do with the Democratic Party. I will not never caucus with the DNC, Kevin saying, and I understand everybody's angst, but I want to make this point again, and I've made it in several of the Uphill Media productions as far as politics go. When you're battling corruption, particularly within these massive, in this duopoly we have, we cannot afford to leave any stone unturned. This is why it is so important to educate yourself, not just from a geeky standpoint, but these are actual rules that have effect on policy. Now, if you can't stand the stench of the corruption that infests the Democratic Party, I understand, we all understand, but we have to work within these parties and outside of these parties to keep the pressure on. It reminds me of the game Stratego when I was growing up. And although this is shouldn't be looked at as a game, it actually is. So that being said, I really want to thank everybody here for participating. Please share and like. Leslie, you had some great questions today. We really appreciate you. Leslie says, really appreciate this live stream. Thank you both. And I want to thank you both as well. Thank you so much.
As the saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it couldn't be more true than in the Democratic Party. So again, I fully empathize with those who have been disgusted with the actions of the Democratic Party. But if you leave, then all of the good people who could affect change are gone. And we're left with people who want to retain the way things are currently being done. And what we really need is for the Democrats of the United States of America to reassert their ownership of the Democratic Party and get these reforms instituted, which is what we're trying to do with People for Democratic Party Reform. So again, I encourage everyone who would like to help in this effort, please join the organization so we can all work together to affect these changes. The establishment loves to make us work in silos, and we're actually breaking down the barriers, and we're working across states and sharing information and things that have worked and successes that we've had so that other people can see that there is hope for correcting things and the path to do it. That's the end of my talk today. Is there anything you'd like to add, Keri?
Yeah, it's a couple things. Ending the silos of, and separating out members and organizations and whatnot is really important because then you don't feel quite so alone and overwhelmed. I totally empathize with the folks who say that, they never want to have anything to do with the party. I have had my moments where I don't want to have anything to do with the party, but you can't change anything if you just go home and don't play. So you got to keep at it. You got to support the people who are willing to keep at it. Because inside and outside are both important, but you always need more help inside those things. And I just want to echo what everybody else has said. Thank you, everybody, for questions and your comments and everything. Really appreciate it. I'm a parliamentarian in large part because, one, I like this stuff and I find it interesting, but I really enjoy teaching other folks about parliamentary stuff and giving them the tools that they need to be empowered and to affect change themselves. because the more we spread this information, the lighter the load for everybody. So my thanks greatly to Oz and for doing such a wonderful job today, and Larry for inviting me on to come and help out. And I'm sure I'll be back for future episodes whenever you want, really. So
thank you, everyone. We're done, Oz.
Thank you.